welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, all about American black bears, presented by wildlife biologist and NatHab Expedition Leader Aaron Bott. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Right now, I'm actually in southern Utah. I'm just heading over to Bryce Canyon to do some work. It's a rainy day out, which is fantastic because across most of the West, we're suffering from a severe drought. It's a little bit alarming, but fortunately today it's gloomy and the water is filling up those red rock canyons. Today we're going to be talking about American black bears, which is a species that a lot of us may be familiar with, or at least we can seem to relate to. And I'm thrilled to be able to share with you some of the human history, the natural history, the biology and the ecology of this wonderful species. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some questions. Really quick, my name is Aaron Bott. I'm a wildlife biologist. I work with both state and federal wildlife agencies, monitoring and researching wildlife from bison to mule deer to bighorn sheep, but primarily I'm involved in large carnivore research. I did a master's degree through Utah State University studying wolves in the Yellowstone area, and I'm currently working on a PhD right now. Again, looking at wolves and also bears and moose and their overlapping social behaviors in the greater Yellowstone area. This is a picture of me just a couple months ago, 1st of March actually, going out and doing black bear den surveys. So this is one of the funner parts of the job, but right here I've got two baby black bears that were in with mom. Mom is safe and sound. We're just checking to see the health of the cubs, and we're also determining the survivability of cubs and checking to see if mom's doing okay. After this, we put the cubs back with mom and then we skedaddle out of there. Meanwhile, she's drugged, she's safe, she's warm, and all went well. But these two cubs here, they're probably about 2 weeks old. You can see they're just tiny. They've got those wonderfully long claws. Their eyes are pretty much closed at this time, and they're typically born almost naked, so they've already been growing quite a lot of fur. But these beautiful and cute little animals, they are generally about 1 pound when they're born, 1 pound or less. And then they can grow to be, for the American black bear, anywhere between 200 and 600 pounds. And we'll talk more about their size and again, their ecology and their biology in just a minute. But I wanted to start today by sharing with you a story that isn't too uncommon. Last time I gave a natural habitat presentation, it was on coyotes, the song dogs of the West. Coyotes are a very fascinating canid, a member of the dog family that live endemically in North America. And what's really exciting about coyotes is, despite human encroachment, despite climate change, despite habitat fragmentation, and other alarming problems that we are facing here in the 21st century all over the world, coyotes have managed to really take advantage of the human-dominated landscape. And in fact, there are more coyotes now than there ever have been, and their range is greater. And what's pretty cool about black bears, or the American black bear, is they share a similar story. So black bears are the smaller cousin of the grizzly bear, also known as the brown bear up in Canada and Alaska. And because they don't really merit, I guess, or I shouldn't say merit, they don't get as much attention as the larger grizzly bear and brown bear, or even the polar bear up north, they kind of have been able to adapt and live in our backyards and coexist with us to some degree of tolerance, which is very unique, again, in this Anthropocene that we're living in this world where humans are sprawling across the landscape and gobbling up wildlife habitat as quickly as we are. So I want to begin today by sharing with you a story that is maybe unusual, but not too uncommon anymore. These are the Teton Mountains in Wyoming, just right on the Wyoming and Idaho border. Grand Teton National Park manages this beautiful natural resource, these granite spires, the forests, the Snake River curling down below those slopes. And this is an area that I grew up. I had the fortune of growing up just 2 miles from Yellowstone National Park, 5 miles from Grand Teton, where I lived and worked. My family had settled this area in the 1800s, and I spent my teenage years climbing in these mountains and having a lot of fun. And when I was about 16 years old, my friends and I, we decided to do a big climbing and backpacking trip up in these mountains. And we come up typically from the Idaho side, so the backside of these mountains on that western slope. And when we were getting ready to head into the backcountry, we met with a national park ranger who warned us that there was a spoiled black bear in the areas that we were planning to explore and to climb and to hike. And we weren't too concerned about it because typically black bears live in areas or in habitat where there's a lot of food or forage or security and shelter. And the higher you get up on the mountains, especially when you get above timberline, you don't generally find bears or any other megafauna for that reason. Just that there's not a lot of food resources for them the further up the mountain you go. So my friends and I, we decided that we would take all bear precautions. And in those days, we didn't have bear spray readily available. It's become more popular over the last couple of decades. And we'd nevertheless bear bagged our food at night. We wanted to be safe and we wanted to be cautious. And lo and behold, when we got up really high into the mountains, we stashed our food and we were pretty surprised to find that there actually was a black bear up in the moraines, up in these rocky, glacier-filled basins. And it surprised us and it shocked us. This is a picture of a black bear that I have taken. This is not the black bear that I'm describing to you right now, because as you can see, it's in a meadow with trees and such. But we were up high in the rocks, and as a bunch of 16-year-old boys, we were startled to find this bear trying to get up onto some old snags where we had roped our bear food, or our food, to keep it safe from the bears. And we ended up yelling at the bear and throwing rocks at it and deterring it and having it scamper away and run away from us. But this bear later was shot and killed by park officials because it was again found trying to get into backpackers' food. It was again trying to exploit resources that were not appropriate for it. We call this spoiled behavior, or rather food habituation, when a bear, which is a very intelligent animal, gets into food or into resources that it shouldn't be getting into, which causes conflict or can potentially be dangerous for people. And tragically, that black bear that I encountered when I was 16 had already had multiple strikes. It had been habituated to food in campgrounds. People had been leaving food out on their picnic tables. I don't know the whole story, but it's even possible that the bear had intentionally been fed by tourists in the park. And ultimately, that led to the bear's demise, because as the bear became habituated to food, it became more aggressive and ultimately threatened people, which was not tolerable according to the Park Service's management of black bears. So today I want to jump into the cultural history, the human history, and of course the natural history of these incredible animals. And when I wrap this presentation up, I hope to really emphasize subjects or points that we can talk about of discussion that will hopefully prevent habituation of bears in the future. Most of us, if we're living in the United States or in Canada, many of us are living in black bear habitat, or at least we have black bear habitat near our homes. And the more we can control ourselves, the more temperance we can have when we go out into the backcountry, the more we'll be able to coexist with these incredible animals, and we won't have to euthanize any of these animals due to our own misbehavior as a species. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I remember being a 16-year-old and thinking how cool it was to experience a black bear in my campsite. And I was fortunate enough to have been educated on how to take care of my smellables and my food so that bears would not get into my food supplies. I was behaving appropriately as a recreator in the bear's home. But I also thought, when I later found out that the bear had been euthanized, how tragic it was that people who perhaps didn't know better had let this incident escalate to the point that the bear had to lose its life. People have been coexisting with large carnivores like black bears for a very long time, and they've always fascinated us. Black bears and humans, we co-evolved, and frankly, large carnivores, although attacks on humans are rare, they are dangerous animals, and they also contend with us for some of our resources. Here in North America, many indigenous Native American tribes, they revered the bear. They utilized its body parts and its hides for special ceremonies, but they also would hunt bears, utilizing the meat and the fat in particular for their own uses. But this painting, which was painted by Edward Curtis in the early 1800s, depicts bands of the Sioux Nation going out on bear hunts. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about large carnivores and coexistence with people and how challenging that can be, it's not just with modern Americans, and it's not just with Euro-Americans. Peoples all over the world for millennia have revered, admired, respected, and even feared these incredible animals. Black bears are perhaps the least they're probably the least recognized as a threat to people when we compare them to, again, their larger and more aggressive cousins, grizzly bears, which are found in North America's western half of the continent. Nevertheless, black bears have a larger range, and they have always had a larger range than grizzly bears. And so because of this, we've had more interaction as a species in North America with black bears than we have had with grizzly bears. Oftentimes we've characterized these incredible animals. This is the most common depiction, I guess you could say, of black bears that we have in our culture today, the teddy bear, which comes from an experience when President Theodore Roosevelt was out bear hunting in Mississippi, and he refused to shoot a roped bear, a bear that had been pre-captured and tied up to a tree. This cartoon then later became a caricature of Teddy Roosevelt, and also of the bear that kind of ironically became his sidekick in later cartoons. And the teddy bear was invented from this incident. Later, it was produced as a toy for children that is still popular today. We also would recognize Smokey the Bear, invented by the U.S. Forest Service in the 1940s during a campaign to encourage the public to prevent wildfires, to put out their campfires appropriately and thoroughly. And actually in 1950, a bear cub was abandoned but then rescued by firefighters in New Mexico and was named Smokey, and was basically the U.S. Forest Service's mascot for a number of years while it resided in a zoo until it ultimately died of old age. So we have these ideas of what bears are. There's black bear diners, there's bear wood carvings that you can pick up anywhere. We're familiar with bears pretty much in all of our media, especially for children, everything from Winnie the Pooh, again, to Smokey the Bear and to teddy bears. But what is the American black bear, and what makes it so unique? Well, the American black bear, or Ursus americanus, is the name given to the most widespread and common species of bear in North America. Like my presentation that I delivered on coyotes, the black bear, the American black bear is endemic to North America. It is not found in Europe or in Asia or in South America. It is solely and completely found here in North America. But the name black bear is somewhat misleading because not all black bears are in fact black. I interact with a lot of people who come out west, or even people who are in the east, that think that, oh, we've got brown bears, or we have grizzly bears in the east, or we have grizzly bears here in some of the western states that in fact we don't have anymore, because the grizzly bear has been extirpated from much of its range. But black bears are relatively common throughout North America. In Alaska, there's approximately 100 to 200,000 black bears. In Canada, we have around 400,000 black bears. And in the contiguous United States, there's anything from 285,000 to 350,000 black bears. And this map here is kind of outlines the range and distribution of black bears in the 21st century. Historically, black bears really evolved in forested areas. Unlike grizzly bears that have really long talons, these huge claws that are 3 to 4 inches long, that are used for shoveling earth and digging up roots or rodents, black bears have shorter claws. You might think of claws like a cat would have. Although black bear claws are not retractable, black bear claws, like cat claws, are very efficient tools for climbing trees, and it's common to find bears living in trees because it's suspected that they evolved in forested areas where they could flee from other predators or from threats and hide out in trees. Black bears pretty much make themselves at home wherever there is a thick forest. And after Euro-American expansion, there was a lot of deforestation, which removed black bear habitat. And so the black bear range and its expansion across North America has since shrunk. Nevertheless, the population of black bears here in the first part of the 21st century has actually rebounded and is perhaps just as rich in diversity as it was when Euro-Americans first made westward expansion, when the Europeans first made contact in North America. So black bears are by far the most abundant species of bear in the whole world. There are 8 different species of bear found all over. We have bears in Europe, bears in Asia, bears in South America, Central America, and the American black bear is certainly the most abundant. In fact, if you add all of the black bear numbers together, their population would be twice that of all other bear species combined. So they are the least threatened of going extinct. This is the picture I took of us working on a black bear. It's drugged right now, and we're putting on a radio collar before it wakes up and heads off into the desert. It's hard to believe that even though black bears did evolve in the forest, they actually are so good at being generalists that they can be found commonly in the desert, where they can live off of pinyon pine nuts and juniper trees. And basically, black bears are very volatile. They're very able to adapt to their environment. Their weight generally is between 200 and 600 pounds. 200 pounds is more common. They might be a little bit less than that even, depending on their distribution and their food resources. But black bears have been documented, particularly in the eastern states, to weigh in excess of 800 pounds, which is tremendous. When I go out and do grizzly bear captures and collaring, our grizzly bears generally weigh around 400 to 600 pounds. So there are black bears that are obese. They're very heavy, they're very large, and those ones that are typically tipping the scales over 700 or even 800 pounds generally are anomalies. They've probably been eating trash, or they've been eating really calorie-rich resources that might not be available to them in a natural setting. Black bears, like all ursids, all bear species, they live a very long time. Their lifespan is generally over 20 years, up to 30 years in the wild. And their diet is primarily vegetation. So ursids, all bears, are in fact carnivores, but they aren't as carnivorous as other carnivores can be. They have evolved with a very simple gut system, a monogastric digestive system similar to us, and they're in fact omnivores, and they eat more vegetation than probably most of you do. They can eat generally 70 to 90% of their diet from vegetative matter. They really depend heavily on plants, roots, shoots, grasses, bulbs, of course, berries, and all of those resources are fantastic to help them grow large. They're eating all the time. That's how they ultimately need to, or that's ultimately how they're able to survive by hibernating in the winter, is by consuming lots and lots of calories at other times of the year to meet their metabolic requirements for reproduction and survival. So due to the differences in available nutrition, there is considerable size variance in bears across the continent. I mentioned previously 200 to 600 pounds is kind of what we're looking at in terms of weight for a black bear. But really this depends on the region. It depends on the available resources. Some bears that really have great access to hickories or to walnuts or to acorns, they're able to pack on a lot of weight, get a lot of calories from these resources. Meanwhile, other bears living in less fertile habitats are typically a lot smaller. But in general, the males are larger than females by 20 to even 50%. And the weight of these animals can vary by 30% depending on the season. So we know that bears hibernate, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, but they're going to be their fattest during a time known as hyperphagia in the late summer, early fall, when they're packing on as much weight as they possibly can before they take a snooze. And when they emerge from their dens, usually 5 or 6 months later, they're going to be a bit slimmer. As I mentioned earlier, not all black bears are in fact black, which can be very confusing to people. In fact, depending on the region that you're living in, the majority of the bears that you have in your backyard might in fact be brown or a reddish brown. We call this a cinnamon bear. They can also be blonde, or they can have a mixture of black and lighter hairs, which give them a bluish appearance. Sometimes those are known as glacier bears because they look so bluish black. And some black bears actually have blonde or white patches on their chests and their necks typically. Then, of course, there's the Kermody bear, also known as the spirit bear. Natural Habitat Adventures offers a trip to go see these. This is a unique and rare genetic variant of the black bear. So even though they are white, they are actually black bears. It was thought at first that they were a different species, and then it was suspected that they might be a subspecies. But we recognize now that it's just a genetic variant. Approximately 200 live in the wild across North America. Most of the ones that are easily seen and they live in a relatively high concentration are found on Princess Royal Island around British Columbia, Canada. So if you want, you can go travel to see these unique bears. Again, believe it or not, they are actually black bears. Now, bears like grizzly bears in North America, black bears, they hibernate. And it's not actually completely correct to say that bears are hibernators, because they have their own unique style of torpor where their body slows down in order to meet their metabolic needs. So some people assume that bears go into hibernation, or they go to sleep during the winter in order to stay warm. But having crawled into many bear dens myself, I can tell you that bear dens are not warm. They're just as cold in many cases as the outside climate. The reason why these animals go to sleep during the winter is because most of their food resources are gone. Most bears eat vegetation, and because they don't have a complex gut system like your deer, your moose, and your elk that are able to digest woody plants and break down the cellulose in those plants during the winter, bears generally will curl up and they'll take a snooze. They'll take a 5-month-long nap in order to survive the dearth, the season when there isn't any food. And they curl up, and what is pretty unique about their quote-unquote hibernation is that although their heart rate and their body temperature does drop, it doesn't drop as dramatically as true hibernators like bats or marmots and ground squirrels. In fact, bears that are hibernating are very able to just snap wide awake, and they're not truly asleep the whole time that they're in their dens. They also have this unique ability to forego any consumption of water, liquids of any type, food resources of any type, and they don't typically defecate or urinate while they're in this state of torpor. Their bodies are adapted in this very cool way to not basically poison themselves. By not defecating and by not urinating, their body generally is capable of recycling these nitrogens in their bodies, these toxins that would otherwise kill us or make us very sick. They don't experience any osteoporosis from being in basically a coma for five months. Their muscles don't atrophy. It's a really cool adaptation that these animals have in order to, again, help them survive a time period when there is not a lot of food on the ground for them to consume. Bears, depending on their habitat, will den in very unique and somewhat bizarre dens. Typically, they'll dig underneath the roots of trees. In the Southwest, they curl up under large boulders after making nests. You can see this old female here. She's nesting on strips of juniper bark. If you go further east of where I'm at, they will den clear up in the tops of trees, large tulip trees that have open or hollowed out caverns or trunks. They'll crawl into those, and there they will take a long nap until it's time to get up. Some bears that live in warm enough climates, including in Florida or parts of Texas, they don't actually hibernate at all because they have no season of dearth. They have food resources year-round, and so they have no need of hibernation. Now, bears, like many other different kinds of mammals, have a unique reproductive system known as delayed implantation, when the embryo doesn't immediately implant in the uterus. So bears generally will reproduce in June and July when they find a mate. They're polygamous. Females will mate with multiple males. Males will mate with multiple females. And during this time, while they're breeding, the female, if she breeds successfully, will not actually become truly pregnant. Again, delayed implantation. The embryo will float within the uterus and will not attach to the uterine wall until she goes into hibernation, at which time the embryo will attach to the uterine wall, and 8 weeks later she will give birth to her cubs. So this is a really unique adaptation that's found in about 100 different mammal species all over the world. It's pretty common in a lot of the mustelids, the weasels, but it's also seen in all of the bear species. So her body needs to be able to meet a certain demand for ingesting enough calories to not only support herself throughout the winter, but also to supply enough fat and nutrients to help her cubs grow within her. And then after they're born, she has to be able to have enough milk to feed them and to nurse them while they're growing before they emerge from the den, typically in May. So the cubs generally are born in January into the 1st of February. On average, black bears have 2 cubs, but they can have 3 or even 4 cubs as well. But typically it's 2 cubs. And again, they're born itty bitty, just about 1 pound, and they nurse, and ultimately they pop out of the den with mom in May, weighing about 20 to 30 pounds. So they're packing on a lot of weight, almost a pound a day. Now, quickly transitioning black bears and grizzly bears are a very different species. They diverged in their evolutionary paths about 3 million years ago to 5 million years ago. Polar bears and grizzly bears are the two other species of bear that we find in North America. So you have Ursus arctos, which is the grizzly bear, sometimes known as the brown bear, depending on the region that you're at. We also have the polar bear. And then, of course, we have Ursus americanus, the black bear, which again is the most numerous and abundant species. But grizzly bears and black bears, because they have evolved separately, they have different behaviors. And depending on where you're recreating or where you live, it's really important for you to be able to recognize which animal you are seeing or perhaps even encountering, because they do behave differently and they have different stress responses. So black bears on the right, you can see, has a bulbous butt. It's not always good to determine the type of species that you're looking at based on the color, again, because black bears can be blonde in appearance, and I've seen grizzly bears be almost black in appearance. But again, the grizzly bear and the black bear do have different stress responses. Black bears, having evolved in the forest, generally will flee up into trees. Grizzly bears are capable of climbing trees to a certain age, but because they evolved out on the open tundra, out on the plains, they typically don't have a very good flight response. And so they're, I guess, characterized as being ornery, and they typically don't back down from a fight as quickly as a black bear might. So depending on where you're going to go recreating or where you live, it's really good to know which type of bear habitat you're going to be exploring. So on this map here, you can see kind of the dark gray represents all of the 21st century's black bear habitat across North America. And you can see that the grizzly bear habitat is greatly reduced in terms of its expansion. Historically, grizzly bears ranged all across the North American West, down through Idaho, Utah, California, Arizona, even through central Mexico. But due to our extirpation of predators in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the grizzly bear range has shrunk dramatically. And now in the lower 48 states, they're primarily found in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming. There's about 6 living in the Cascades of the state of Washington. But black bears, on the other hand, their population has grown and is again estimated to be just as much as it ever was when Europeans first made contact in North America. But their range has shrunk, primarily again to forested areas. So if you're going to go out and about and go recreating, it's important to know which habitat has bears and which does not. So I highly recommend that if you're going to go on a hike, know if you're in bear country or not. And if you're going to come out west or go up into Canada and then into Alaska, it's important to know if you have grizzly bears as well as black bears on the landscape. Again, because each animal can respond and act differently to different stressful situations. We often point out on grizzly bears that they have this very large hump up over their shoulders. That hump is a big muscle, again, used for digging. Think of a grizzly bear kind of like a badger. They sort of have the same temperance as a badger as well. They can be ornery and territorial. Black bears have this large bulbous butt, and they have basically a straight-faced profile, whereas grizzly bears have a dish-shaped profile. But ultimately, what it comes down to, if you really want to determine whether you're looking at a grizzly bear or a black bear, because sometimes it can even be misleading for the professionals, especially at a great distance, and when you have a hard time judging the size of these animals at a great distance. Claws are always indicative of which species you're looking at. So again, the grizzly has a very long claw used for digging. You can see there that the black bear has a shorter claw, and because of this, the tracks of the animals are very different. So you can always determine which species is which by looking at their tracks. Of course, if you encounter one of these animals and you can see the claws firsthand, then you are too close to the animal to begin with. So you need to maintain a distance and back away. But ultimately, black bears are pretty docile. They don't behave in a predatory manner typically. It's unusual if they ever do attack people, but due to their high density in some areas, it does happen. Just like the more people you have driving on the road, the more of a chance you have of getting in a car accident is going to be. If you have a lot of black bears on the landscape, you need to behave appropriately so that you can mitigate any potential conflict. This is from Yellowstone National Park during the early days of our wildlife management here in North America. We definitely did not behave as good as we should have been. We extirpated most of our large ungulates, our bison, our elk, our deer. We killed almost all of our predators, and that included black bears. We reduced their range extensively. We considered them pests. But in areas like national forests and the national parks, bears were treated basically as novelties, almost as pets. This is a picture of one of the early superintendents of Yellowstone National Park, Horace Albright, who was a fantastic conservationist in his own right. But again, we didn't really understand how wildlife management and ecology and conservation worked. And so we tended to misbehave when it came to our bears. My family grew up out of Yellowstone, and I remember my dad and my grandparents talking about the bears being all over the roads. When the parks were first being managed in Yellowstone National Park's case, from 1872 until the late 1860s, the national parks were managed as a playground for the people. They didn't have as much of an emphasis on protection and conservation and preservation for wildlife and natural resources. So the bears were spared the persecution that was delivered to the wolves and the cougars, primarily because the bears were cute, and in some bizarre ways, they remind us of ourselves. They're a little bit like humanoids, big hairy humanoids, and for whatever reason, that strikes a cultural nerve within most of us. And so bears were primarily protected from extirpation. However, that didn't mean we behaved appropriately with all bears. In fact, because we were feeding bears handouts, a lot of bears ended up dying because they would get too close to the road, they would get hit by cars, or they would begin to act aggressively and boldly around people. And people are, to put it grossly, they're a lot weaker, softer, and squishier than bears are. And so if a bear is trying to get food from a person, if they perceive a person as a means for food, not as food, but to supply food, they might become irritated and swat at a person or potentially attack a person. And then we end up with broken bones or cuts or worse. So the park in the 1970s, Yellowstone National Park and the rest of the National Park Service came up with this program that a fed bear is essentially a dead bear, and it is not okay to feed bears. Now, because bears are omnivorous, they eat meat and they eat vegetation, they are generalists, and it should be no surprise to us that black bears will be very happy to eat human and pet food. When a bear is preparing for hibernation, it needs to consume as much as, in some areas, 20,000 calories a day. And because 90% of its diet is vegetation, that's 20,000 calories of dry salad that it's got to consume every day. So when a bear experiences a rush from eating rich calories left out by humans in the form of a Twinkie, dog food, bird seed, hummingbird feeders, it should be no surprise that the bears quickly become habituated to human resources for food rather than natural resources for food. And in these cases, we find bears loitering around garbage dumps or in towns, looking to consume the refuse of humans. And in some places, we have to ask ourselves, especially where I live, should we be practicing certain types of behavior as a human species where we coexist with bears and other predators? For example, I really like putting out bird seed. or rather, I really like seeing birds come to bird feeders. But if I have bears in my neighborhood or bears in my yard, then those bears are going to become habituated to stealing and raiding my birdseed. And this type of behavior is not okay. Feeding wildlife is not generally a good thing, because once animals become habituated, particularly smart animals like bears become habituated, they can become less predictable and even dangerous. Again, it's not that they start to prey upon people, but they do begin to associate people with a source of food and not something to be wary of. And when that happens, people tend to get hurt and bears tend to die. They get hit by cars or they get euthanized by people who are afraid of the bears. But again, bears being omnivores, they can live just about anywhere. This is a shot taken of a farmer going through his fields, harvesting his crop, and out comes a bear that was in there munching and getting fat and happy. We deal in my line of work with a lot of black bears raiding crops, whether it be corn or watermelons or what have you, but it's trying to keep those bears away from eating crops. Again, they're generalists, and that's what's made them so successful when it comes to rebounding on the landscape. So across North America, most black bears had a decline, but we've also seen a large resurgence, again, because like the coyote, black bears are able to exploit resources in their favor that we also like to use or that we also depend upon. So to a large extent, the comeback of the species has been a consequence of the restrictions of killing. We don't go out and shoot black bears willy-nilly anymore. There's a hunting season which regulates how many bears can be killed or removed from a landscape. And fundamentally, it all comes down to public perceptions too. People don't necessarily perceive bears as much of a nuisance in some areas anymore. We have a general appreciation of biodiversity as a society. That doesn't mean that everyone shares these same thoughts or these beliefs, but there definitely has been a shift in the public perception. However, the success of this species is also due to its biological adaptiveness. So even though our management of wildlife has changed, even though our perceptions of wildlife has changed in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we definitely have to appreciate that this animal is extremely adaptive. Some species, in the light of climate change and habitat fragmentation, some species are going to fare better than others. Black bears, like the coyote, they're adaptive, they're generalists, and they can coexist with us as long as we decide that we can coexist with them. So ultimately, the ball is in our court. So to end with, I'd like to talk to, I guess, wrap things up and circle back to how I began this talk. As a 16-year-old, I encountered a bear, and I was excited to see that bear, and I'm glad that I behaved appropriately in bear country so as to not threaten that bear. But unfortunately, other people had misbehaved and had habituated that bear to resources that later negatively impacted that bear and ultimately led to that bear's demise. So I'd like to conclude my talk by talking about how we can better coexist with bears, because ultimately, again, the ball is in our court. If we want to see more bears on the landscape, it's up to us to behave appropriately. That means that we need to be careful when we're on the landscape. When we go trail running or hiking or walking or mountain biking, we need to understand that some activities might be dangerous, and we have to shoulder that responsibility of living in bear country and understand that some things are dangerous, and we definitely don't want anyone to be attacked and killed by a bear. Unfortunately, the people or the demographic that is at highest risk of a predatory attack are children, and I don't think it's acceptable for us, primarily speaking here as a group, as adults, to put our children at risk because of our lack of understanding, our lack of education and communication with how we should behave on the landscape. So if you're in bear country, or if you're going out into bear country to recreate, It's important to remember to avoid areas where bear activity is high. And you can ask authorities, your Forest Service rangers, your state park rangers, your national park rangers. Ask about bear activity in the area that you're going to go recreate. Know before you go. Also be aware of tracks and scat and carcasses. Bears become very defensive around food resources or caches that they need, and they'll get ornery if you are stumbling around and messing with their food resources. So again, be aware of what bear tracks look like, of what bear scat looks like. Probably the biggest and most advantageous thing that you could do for your safety and for the continued coexistence of bears and people is to travel in a group. Hike in groups of 3 or more, talk out loud, laugh, have fun, make noise. Ultimately, the last thing you want to do is surprise a bear. Most bear attacks occur when people are quiet, they're moving fast, they're in thickets, and they surprise the bear is surprised by them, and then the bear feels threatened and attacks. Again, this is uncommon, but it does happen. So you never want to surprise a bear. Moving together in a group is a great thing to do, plus it generally makes your outdoor recreation activities funner. Things to remember, there is bear spray out on the market. Bear spray is basically a pepper spray. It's capsaicin mixed in an oil base. It's pressurized in an aerosol can. Bear spray is a tool that was invented for grizzly bears. In some areas, it's not actually permitted to carry bear spray. Last time I was in Yosemite or working in Yosemite where they only have black bears. This may have changed, but when I was there, bear spray was not allowed on backcountry trails, despite there being a high density of black bears. The reason why is because bear spray, with so many bears out there, can be a dangerous tool when people could potentially spray each other. If you don't know how to use bear spray, then you should learn how to use bear spray. But I do appreciate bear spray because I think it's effective on more than just bears. I've used it on moose, and I think that in terms of personal safety, human predators are out on the landscape too, and having bear spray is a nice tool to have. There are gimmicks out there like bear bells, which don't generally work in terms of a resource for protecting or making noise so that you do not startle a bear. It's better just to talk and to have conversations with your friends and to laugh, or even to clap your hands and yell, hey bear, every time you come around densely wooded areas where you're afraid that you'll encounter bears. Be alert, and of course keep all food and garbage properly stored in bear-proof containers and away from where you sleep. Bears, again, very rarely act in a predatory manner. They don't come after people to eat people, generally. Sometimes it does happen, but generally they don't. More often than not, someone has a Snickers bar in the tent. A habituated bear comes to the tent at night looking for that Snickers bar, and you, the human, are inconveniently in the way. And the bear might bite you, it might swat at you, and that's why it's very important to not carry any smellables on you, and definitely don't bring them into the tent with you when you go camping. And I always like to remind people too that if there's not a bear in the area, rodents and squirrels and chipmunks, they'll gnaw through your expensive sleeping bag and tents just to get to your food items as well. So if it's not a bear that you're afraid of, be afraid of those chipmunks gnawing through your $300 down mummy bag. So you can stash your food in bear vaults. Again, hike in groups of 3, be heard, make noise. If you do encounter a bear, never run from it. Bears can reach a maximum of 35 to 45 miles per hour. That's a lot faster than you can run. They look big and awkward and slow, but they're very fast. Avoid hiking in the dark, and ask yourself, if you're going into bear country, should we be doing this? What level of responsibility, what level of risk are you okay with? If you know that bears are in an area where you are going to play, you have to be responsible for how you're going to play. You have to ask, is this going to be this activity that I'm going to be participating in? For example, in this picture, we have a mountain biker. It's high risk because you're moving fast, generally quietly, and you're rounding steep trails and corners where you could encounter a bear. So you have to take some level of responsibility and ask yourself, what level of risk are we okay with? It's not, in my opinion, okay for us to push animals like bears out of their homes just so that we can have a fun day to go out and play. Generally, again, these are the last things to remember. Black bears are harmless, typically, and inoffensive. But every bear, just like every wild animal, is potentially dangerous. So maintain a distance. I stick with the national parks suggestion of 100 yards. So if a bear gets closer to me, I back up. I maintain that distance. In some ways, the seemingly docile nature of black bears leads us to take more chances around them than their much feared relative, the grizzly bear. They're terrified of grizzly bears. And so they generally don't take black bears seriously. This is a mistake. All bears should be taken seriously, especially if you have children nearby. Keep them safe, keep them close, and be responsible. Put your food away. Don't leave food out for bears to get into. And if attacked, fight back. In conclusion, these are two resources that I recommend people look into. The one on the left is published by the famous Dr. Stephen Herrero. Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance is a book that's been reprinted many times. There's multiple editions out there, but ultimately Dr. Herrero was the individual who kind of first started to study bear ecology and began to help us understand how we should behave in case we do have a negative experience with one of these animals on the trail. And this other book here on the right-hand side, Bears Without Fear, it's a great resource, very friendly for the public to read, to explore. These are two great books. Check them out if you want to learn more about bears. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation that we've had, this discussion on black bears. They're an incredible animal. It's so exciting to see a carnivore on the landscape. I hope that we can continue to find ways to coexist with these animals so that we can continue to share our adventures in the wild with them for right now and for future generations to come. So thanks.
All right, that was great, Aaron. Thank you so much. We've got some good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. All right, the first question I'm going to ask, a few people asked, and it pertains to that first photo you showed of yourself holding the cubs. A few people were just wondering if your smell would imprint on the cubs and what the mother's reaction would be to your smell, if so.
That's a good question. So when we go in to do these reproductive surveys for bear cubs and to check and see what their viability is, we actually take some Vaseline, or not Vaseline, some Vapor Rub with us that we, after darting the female, even though she's hibernating, she is, like I said, easily roused and she can wake up quickly. So we dart her and chemically immobilize her while we take the cubs out, check their health and their viability, and we then Vapor Rub on her nose so that she will not be able to smell the cubs or our scent on the cubs afterwards. And then after she licks the Vapor Rub off and rubs it all off, she'll be a little bit confused perhaps, but she doesn't abandon her cubs. She'll take the cubs back in, and then we stick a trail camera to watch as they emerge from the den, typically 2 months later. And then we radio collar the female as well, and we monitor them over the next couple of years while she takes care of those cubs.
Well, that is so interesting. I had never heard that before. All right, we've got a few questions about reproduction and babies, so I'll start with those. Someone submitted this question: is it true that the embryo will be absorbed and not attached to the uterus if the female does not have sufficient fat to successfully give birth and raise the cubs?
Yes, that is true. I'm impressed that someone knew that. So if the female doesn't have enough fat reserves when she goes into hibernation, even if she had bred earlier that summer, her body will not accept that embryo, and it will dissolve and be reabsorbed into her body. So she has to be fat enough to survive herself and also to meet the the nutritional demands of those cubs that will grow within her and then later be born.
Mm-hmm. Are black bears born with claws?
They are born with claws. You can see in that picture where I was holding them, they are black bears, but when their body is small, those claws look very large, almost like little grizzly bear claws. But yes, they are born with claws.
And are the babies active and awake during that hibernation phase, or are they in a type of torpor?
They are awake. Another good question. So they are awake, and the female wakes up actually to give birth. So it's not like she's hibernating and then, 5 months later she wakes up and she's like, whoa, where'd these little guys come from? She is awake and she kind of is snoozy and groggy, which is again why we chemically immobilize her while we're doing these surveys. But the babies are mewing and they're kind of growling, and it's kind of funny to say growling, more like they're just really noisy, they're fussy, they're drinking milk. And typically when we come up on these dens, oftentimes the den opening is covered by snow. And so we listen and listen and listen to see if we're in the right area. And we can generally hear the mewing and the gurgling and the babbling of the cubs before we go into the dens.
So a couple questions pertaining to that map you showed earlier. First one is, why are there no bears in Nevada? This person says that the habitat seems similar to Arizona, where there are black bears.
Good question. So right here, Nevada historically, even pre-European contact, really hasn't had black bears. And Arizona does have some high elevation plateaus and actually gets more moisture and has more pinyon pines, which are a rich resource for these bears, more so than the state of Arizona, or excuse me, more so than the state of Nevada. Nevada is the driest state in the United States. It doesn't get as much moisture, and because that Great Basin, that topography kind of limits any expansion of black bears, they just really haven't ever penetrated the state of Nevada. Comparatively, Utah on its entire western front, that Great Basin stretch, again, has very few black bears.
All right. And has U.S. Fish and Wildlife or the national parks made any effort to close the gaps on that map on the black bear habitat? And do you think this would happen eventually, naturally?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services has not. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services generally only manages migratory bird species or endangered or threatened species. So black bears, even though they have lost a lot of their range, the population, like I said earlier, is estimated to be as high as it has ever been, even prior to European contact. In order for those gaps on the map to be filled with black bears, we need better habitat. Most of that area has been deforested and has had a lot of ag fields put out for human use. And so without the habitat, it's unrealistic to bring bears back. So if we somehow could reforest some of those areas, then I think we could expect to see black bears recolonizing those open areas on the map, those blank spots on the map.
Question about spirit bears. Are they leucistic? And if so, do they have a different lifespan than darker pigmented black bears? And also related to that, someone asked, what is the max life of a black bear?
So the maximum life of a black bear in the wild is generally around 30 years. Typically, they can reach over 20 years. They have sexual senescence. That means or reproductive senescence, excuse me, when their reproductive organs start to fail them, generally in their 20s. So they stop reproducing in their late 20s, which is impressive. That's most of their life. In captivity, they can live quite a bit longer. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the oldest black bear in captivity lived to, but the oldest grizzly bear in captivity lived to 50 years, maybe even a little bit older if I'm getting my years wrong. So that's very impressive. As far as the spirit bears go, they're not leucistic. They have a regressive gene that basically comes from two black bears that both have that gene, and then they can pass it on to their offspring. And it's interesting because you can have litters of cubs where one might be white and the other one might be black. So it's kind of a weird, bizarre chance of regressive genes. So pretty unique.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of people have asked that you put the book slide back up for a moment so they can write down those titles. Thank you. So we're past the top of the hour, so I'm going to take just a couple more questions before we call it. So these are more about safety. Someone submitted that they often hike alone, but with a big dog, and they're just wondering if you recommend taking big dogs on hikes in terms of bear safety.
Good question. I should point out that I have offered a natural habitat webinar on wildlife attacks that you can watch on the YouTube channel. And I go into more detail there because you have to consider which type of predators are in the areas where you're recreating. Cougars, for example, behave differently from bears, but dogs can be a catch-22. Dogs, no matter their size, are very ambitious when it comes to getting into a scuffle, if you will. We're all familiar with little dogs and how territorial they can be and yippy and yappy. So even with a big dog, it might chase after a bear, and the bear might run. And I would say the odds are that that would be the case. The bear will run and it will probably climb a tree and you'll be okay. But there is always the chance, and this does happen, where the dog chases the bear and then the bear realizes that it's bigger than the dog and it turns around and chases the dog, and the dog comes back to the owner looking for security and for help, and then the owner gets attacked. So what I would recommend is if you have a small dog or a medium-sized dog even, don't count on them being of any help. If you do have a big dog, it's good to keep your dog on a leash because that bear is not going to come around as long as that dog is barking and looking scary.
And final question I'll take today. Someone was wondering if they encounter a bear and it is not responsive to loud noises, what's the alternative?
You always want to maintain a distance from that animal. So if you're making noise and that bear is not responding, then I would back away. I would retreat without turning my back onto the bear. As soon as I'm a safe distance away, then I would turn around and I would get out of there as safely and quickly as possible. If the bear is acting very bizarrely, then even more so, I would just get out of there and go pick a different hike, or go back a certain distance if you're backpacking, set your pack down at a safe distance and wait for an hour or two. Wait until more hikers come up the trail and you can all move as a group together to try and get around that bear. Or yeah, if it's just a day hike, then maybe just call it quits and go home.
All right, well, Aaron, this has been so informative. Thank you so much for taking the time to present today. I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have any questions about our U.S. National Parks adventures or that Spirit Bears trip that Aaron mentioned earlier, you can give us a call at the number on the screen, and an adventure specialist will be happy to answer any questions you have. All right, Aaron, I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I always wish that I could do these presentations live because it's very exciting to have discussions and interaction one-on-one, or at least face-to-face. Nevertheless, I hope that you had your curiosity and interest piqued in these incredible creatures, American black bears, a very incredible species that I think, unfortunately, we often take for granted. But I hope you've now been encouraged to go and learn more about these animals, and again, remember that it's up to us to promote coexistence in any way that we can, because we're the alpha dogs on the landscape now. So it's important for us to set the standard of coexistence by behaving appropriately in habitat with bears.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aaron. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And of course, keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.